For those joining us for the first time, it's great to have you. And for those who are repeat customers, we're glad that you've enjoyed these conversations and are again with us today. So last summer, we discussed culture in a post-pandemic workplace and noted that it is an evolving experiment. We promised to check in down the line to reassess what's been successful and where there's room for improvement. Well, here we are. We have another year of data and experience to draw upon for our session today. One of the panelists from that conversation, Allison Taylor, is now back as moderator for today's discussion, and it's great. And we're pleased that she's joined by other experts, Jay, Roshni, and Ben, to share their perspectives and scholarship with us. Now, in the recesses of our minds, we may remember the early days of the pandemic. We were adapting to working totally remotely, many of us for the first time. We're also juggling homeschooling children, testing sourdough bread recipes, or joining a Zoom happy hour. And I can say personally, I've become an expert pizza maker. Now, this was all against a terrifying backdrop of COVID-19 with fear of what was to come. It was incredibly challenging, but we learned a lot about the capabilities of technology and our ability to get work done while balancing other responsibilities. Then we had the back to work plans. For many institutions, there was a test phase and an adjustment to a timeline because of emerging variants and changing circumstances, and then back to another test phase. And we learned a lot about how much we missed when we were physically apart. And we began to integrate remote and in-person work. Now that brings us to now, the end of 2022. At the New York Fed, we've been operating with a flexible work model that has most employees in around 2 days a week. And from the Fed feedback I receive, and from my own experience firsthand, it's working well for us, so we're staying on that track. Other institutions and companies have come up with similar or different plans than they feel works best for them. And regardless of the new workplace model a company chooses to implement, leaders can expect their decision to shape organizational culture and have implications for behaviors, for norms, and shared identity. Of course, these things evolve and there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So it's really great to have these conversations and learn from experts how they're thinking about topics like physical space and behavior, norms in a hybrid environment, a revolving relationship with technology, and much, much more. So before I turn it over to Allison, I'll make 2 quick plugs. First, we'll be circulating a poll to get your feedback in these sessions. We want them to be as informative and engaging as possible, so I encourage you to share your thoughts with us. Second, be on the lookout for the next Culture podcast episode that will drop later this year. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the next hour or so. And Allison, I'll turn over the mic to you.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm so thrilled to be returning to discuss this topic. And I think when I was on this panel last year, even though it was 2021, we were still somewhat in this kind of emergency mode. And now we're looking at the new normal and wondering what that might look like. And I want to start off by sharing something that happened to me a few weeks ago. A young man that was in my class came up to me after class and he said, I'm 26. He said, I'm on the border between millennials and Gen Z. And he said, I am the last generation that graduated and spent any time in an office before COVID. And I just found that so mind-blowing that I've been sitting with it since and really been left with all these questions about norms and culture and leadership and technology and how we might start to rethink culture in this new world. So luckily, we've got a bunch of brilliant people this morning to help us unpick some of these questions. We have Roshni Ravindran, who is an assistant professor of business administration at UVA Darden School of Business. She's a faculty fellow affiliated with the Batten Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and she's one of the 40 best business professors under 40. Her work focuses on understanding the future of work and particularly how technological advancements influence organizational actors, workplace practices, and the management of employees. Then we have Jay Van Bavel. He's an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at NYU. He's an affiliate at the Stern School of Business, where I am, in management of organizations, and director of the Social Identity and Morality Lab. He's also the co-author of a brilliant book called The Power of Us, Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony. And then last but not least, we have Ben Waber, who is the president and co-founder of a company called Humanize that provides science-based analytics and data-driven insights that help companies make continuous workplace improvements that benefit employees in the business. So Humanize delivers ongoing macro and micro views of an organization's effectiveness and health. And Ben's work has been featured everywhere, and he's consulted for a bunch of industry leaders. So I'm sure we'll be able to tease out a little bit more about their backgrounds and experience as we proceed. But I'm going to jump in and start off with Jay and ask for some thoughts on how norms are shaped. One thing that was very interesting last year when we were on this panel is that we've seen a huge rise in whistleblowing and also a huge rise in retaliation. So that's one kind of interesting way to think about how norms might be formed and how we might be slightly less subject to group norms than we used to be. So has it become harder to shape norms via shared identities? Are we becoming increasingly individualistic? Are we expecting a more bespoke approach to work? What's your view on how where we are affects our notion of shared identity and group dynamics?
Yeah, thanks, Allison. So I want to just basically say my position as a social psychologist is that social norms are one of the most powerful drivers of behavior. And the way that we determine what the norms are is we look to people like us or people in our in-group to determine what those norms are. We're not looking at people who are part of different groups that we don't identify with to determine what the norms are. And a norm is essentially like what someone like me ought to do in this situation. And they can be really useful, especially when you join a new group or a new organization. You're looking around to see what people like you are doing, and that helps you determine how to fit in and be a good group member. Now, I would argue, I think Allison did a great lead up to this, that we are in a moment where a lot of our norms have just been erased. It feels like every week there's a new issue. Every time I look at LinkedIn on a trending topic, it's basically a huge debate about like what's going to happen when we work remotely. Are people coming back to work? How is that going to play out? And we honestly don't have really good scripts for these things. And so that means that a lot is being negotiated. And so that has some downsides. And so at my work, I run a group of about 50 faculty and researchers. And I met with all the leaders the other day. And basically over the last 3 years, a lot of them don't know how to do things just because the way they used to do it was determined by norms. They would ask someone who'd been there longer and figure it out. And I realized how much has been lost in those last few years just by losing the sense of norms. Of course, there's an opportunity here, right? Which is that we can create new norms and we can define kind of a new normal that is not only as good as the old normal, but hopefully much better. It can be more inclusive. It can be more ethical. It can be more efficient. We can leverage all the technologies we have, like we're doing on this panel right now, to connect with a broader audience in ways that are, less onerous for all the panelists and visitors to come in. And so those things are really cool and exciting. However, if you want to make norms happen and develop new norms, I would say there's a few things you got to do. One is you have to make them visible. And so if you're doing something behind the scenes and no one's seeing it, it might be a habit. There's a lot of research on, how to make yourself more efficient at work and stuff like this. But it actually doesn't work as a norm if no one can see it. The second thing is you really want leaders or people who are attracting a lot of attention to be doing it, to embodying the norm, not just saying these are our values, but they should be living it. And then the third thing I would say is that you need to look at people like you and see what they're doing. And so one of the ways this has been done, one of my favorite studies on this was they looked at anti-bullying norms in schools in New Jersey. And what they did, what the researchers did is before they kind of rolled out this campaign, in one of the conditions of the study, they found people who are at the hubs of social networks. And so, the way this was framed in the media is these are the popular kids, but they don't necessarily need to be the popular kids. It can be a kid who's on the band, in band, on the football team and on the chess team. And so they don't fit your profile of like a traditional popular kid, but they're connected to lots of groups. And so people look to them about what the norms are. And so the condition that was most effective, even more effective than just like messaging the whole school, was getting and deputizing those people, those hubs of the social networks, to be kind of the speakers, the voice of these new norms on this anti-bullying campaign. And so those would be a few things that I would recommend that you could do right now if you have an organization and you want to change the norms. Is first design what your norms are going to be and then make them visible, make sure leaders embody them, and then identify people who are the hubs of social network and get them to be kind of like your proselytizers, your deputies who go out and embody those and communicate them to other people. And then the last thing, and this is often just as important, if not more important, goes to Allison's point about punishment of whistleblowers, is you have to reward people engaging in the normative behaviors that you value. And so if you say we value this, but you reward the opposite behavior with salaries and promotions and corner offices, you're going to get the opposite behavior. And so you really have to think of what those norms are and reward them. So that's kind of my gospel of norms.
Amazing. So norms, it sounds as if shaping norms and thinking deliberately about norms is a huge opportunity, but only if you think about it in a deliberate way and plan around it and try to shape it. And the impression I'm getting out there is more that a lot of organizations have sort of defaulted to hybrid and said, come in a couple of days, we're not going to specify a couple of days. And we're sort of ending up as well with a bunch of people then coming into the office and sitting on Zoom with feedback on each other's desks. And there's more a dissolution of norms and a sense that nobody is really taking control and thinking about this. So what we need to do is get to grips with this. And if we can maybe shape culture in a more healthy and deliberate way. I also thought it was intriguing what you said about finding those hubs in networks and using them to drive change for better and worse. So maybe I could turn now to Roshni. I have been thinking a lot, but a little lost, and hoping you can help me about the role of technology in this new environment. I, again, just read a paper from a student in class where his employer had decided to put in keystroke tracking software and all this sort of software to detect when people were at their desks and what work they were doing. That was not revealed to any of the employees until the time came to performance management, when suddenly there was all this information put in front of people, and that went down extremely badly. So can you talk a little bit about employee surveillance and the role of technology here, and how maybe we can make this a force for good in the way that Jay describes, rather than the entry point to an even more dystopian future?
Thank you, Allison. It's one of those things that really has baffled me over the last 2 years, which is when employers think about getting people back into the workforce, into the office, the most immediate thing is, what do we do about all of the things that we did to track them over the last 2 years? Because it all started with this, oh, everybody's going off and working from home, so we need to put some measures in place to make sure that everybody is working and working appropriately and productivity isn't going down. I want to highlight a couple of things. Over the pandemic, there have been a number of studies from as early as May 2020, a Harvard Business School study, which I think Ben was a part of, which said that people actually were more productive while they were working from home. They didn't need these types of tools to get people to track them and to make them feel like they were being monitored all the time. The second thing that I will highlight is, during this span, there were technologies that were developed. One notable example that I think everybody might have heard about is Microsoft's tool that allowed companies to actually track something like 75 or 76 metrics. Things like, do you have your webcam on? Are you contributing to shared documents? Are you, online and responding to people on Slack messages? So lots of things that really were those little metrics for whether or not you were working. All of this is coming from a place of, oh, we don't know what's going to happen, and so let's default to not trusting our employees. So what I thought was really fascinating, and some of this work was inspired by a lot of the stuff that Ben does in his company. So we actually started exploring what it is about tracking and how can tracking be done in a way that is actually informational but not evaluative. Now, let's all think about, all of the devices that we own. Things like our smartwatch that tells us we've been sitting for 4 hours, so it's about time to get up and take a walk. Or things like, breathe like for a second because you've just been sitting and, your heart rate is high, so it's important for you to pause and breathe. So all of these things are valuable information about our own behaviors. Now, as somebody that is writing, all of us on the panel would know there are times that we actually write really well and there are times that we don't. And so it would be nice to have something that is on our computer that would tell us, actually, Roshni, you write really well in the mornings, so maybe don't have meetings in the morning and have meetings in the afternoon. That would be helpful. But do I actually want my boss to know some of this information? That's the question. So our research has shown that when we think about tracking, it's important to not think about yes or no, but it's important to think about the how. And the way to think about tracking is, how can organizations think about tracking where they can put the power in the hands of the people and start from a place of trust? Our research shows that when you can set up these systems where the point of these systems is to be informational rather than evaluative or for a monitoring purposes, it actually increases intrinsic motivation. It makes people more open to these types of devices. It is one of those things that actually people desire to have because they want more information and feedback about their own behaviors.
So there's huge opportunity in technology if it comes from a basis of trust rather than being a compensatory factor where bad managers use it because they don't trust their employees and they need to be worrying about how exactly they're spending their time. You also made me think of this idea from Anne Helen Peterson about LARPing your job. That stands for live action role play. So she describes this situation where people are performatively on Slack, performatively calling meetings, trying to look like they're working according to these technology tools at the expense of actually doing any work. Yeah. So Ben, let's get your thoughts on norms as well. If we're hearing that kind of soft pressures, just looking around you, looking at what your boss is doing when they eat lunch, etc., are less important. We don't directly influence each other as much. We've seen the invasion of these new technology tools. If norms are harder to create, do other incentives become more important in shaping behaviors? Which ones? How have you been thinking about the evolution of norms in this strange new world that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I do still think that there are ways to influence norms, even remotely. And I do also want to draw a distinction between, during the height of the pandemic and what that meant in terms of remote work, and then the opportunities we have in terms of things like events that we didn't have during the pandemic. I'm actually quite bullish on those. I don't have enough data on that yet to say definitively that those will work, but I do think there's a lot of compelling evidence, pre-pandemic at least, that again, when teams that even work remotely meet in person before a project, that their collaboration patterns look statistically identical to some that work in person more frequently, right? So I think there are things like that are in our toolbox that we forget about. And as Jay was saying, there is a lot of the data that we have around how work happens globally, at least for information workers, to humanize. We do have a globally representative data set. We could talk about that. But what we've seen is that behaviors of leadership in particular are much more influential than they were pre-pandemic. And again, specific classes of behaviors, to be fair, right? So here's the thing. Imagine the CEO sends you an email at 2 a.m., right? That is all you see of the CEO's behavior now, right? Whereas in the past, again, if you're physically together more frequently, then as Jay was saying, you can look around, you can sort of see, generally what's going on. That's abnormal, right? However, you don't know that. You have no idea what people are doing the rest of the day. Now, again, as Roshni was saying, that doesn't mean that people aren't working. Like, that is, evaluate whether people are doing their job from their output, not like how many keystrokes you're doing. Like, that, not correlated with anything, right? But
Sounds
again, this idea that if I'm a leader, exactly. But again, if I'm a leader and I do something, everybody sees it now, and that is all you see, and that dramatically influences like things like workday length, much more than it did pre-pandemic, because it was less visible, right? But again, of course, there are other things, like as Jay was saying, that are certainly less visible. I mean, we see a pretty significant reduction in weak ties, and we could talk about how we define that. But again, in terms of how people collaborate, significantly lower than it was pre-pandemic, which has all sorts of implications for how norms and just information more generally, spread across the organization. And so those certainly are concerns. But I think that what I would just really want to emphasize is that I don't think that people should just say pre-pandemic norms were good. And I think Jay was getting to this point. Like, it's not that they were good. If we're being honest, even pre-pandemic, I mean, when it comes to how we work, the way that most management works, right, is that companies say, oh, well, or like an executive will say, well, I've been successful in my career. And in my career, I worked in this way. So that's the way to be successful, right? Or they say, oh, well, here's another company that's been very successful and they work in this way. That must be why they're successful. That's actually unclear. And so I think that what is a lot more healthy is to admit that, hey, we maybe have hypotheses about how we should work, what norms we should have, but we don't know, and we need to test those things. And importantly, the way that we work needs to change over time, right? Like, it is actually insane to say, oh, well, even if you could wave a magic wand and say, here, I have the optimal way to work and optimal norms today, in a month, a couple months, that's not going to be optimal because the world changes, because your work changes, all these things. And so if instead we say, all right, what are part of the norms that companies, I think, and individuals need to develop is, this idea of much more constant change and much more experimentation and more transparency around this. Again, I think as Rashni was saying, this idea of saying, listen, your team, when you work remotely, communicates 20% less with these other teams that you need to work with. Our hypothesis is that if you come in one day more a week, that will increase, but we don't know. And so what we're going to do is we're going to test it, and then over the next quarter, we'll look at it, and then we'll communicate that to everybody. Again, you're never going to make 100% of people happy with any management decision, right? However, reasonable people would see that, say, okay, I understand, and then you can transparently do that, and then you can change. And then the idea is next quarter, it could say, hey, well, that worked, but actually now our work needs to change, and so we have to keep iterating. And what people showed during the pandemic, again, is how resilient they are, and how if you give people a good reason, they can dramatically change how they work in a couple weeks. You don't need a 6-month change management exercise, right? But again, a good reason is not the CEO says to do this. Again, I would argue it's not all sort of quantitative data, like what, it's part of that. I do think it really does need to be part of that, because I personally think I'm not saying subjective data or qualitative data doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But there are certain things that people are just very bad at observing. Not because they're idiots. It's just we don't have certain perspectives on how we work. And so I do think you need a combination of these things to be able to move it forward.
Yeah, fascinating. So this was very striking to me. In fact, it's been striking to me throughout the pandemic how many CEOs have gone out there and made these incredibly overconfident pronouncements about how their cultures are and how we're going to go back and this is how it's going to be. And what you're advocating, Ben, which is music to my ears, are ethical systems as well. And I know to the other two speakers is experiment, ask questions, do not assume that you know. If you could take some ideas from academia and put them in organizations, and the benefits could be absolutely enormous, but it requires you to take a mindset where you are asking questions, testing, getting data, having a control group, and then you could be in this massively advantageous position. So let's go back to Jay and to one sector where I have in particular seen these incredibly overconfident pronouncements about how things really are, which is, of course, financial services. And so many in the banking industry have pointed to this idea of an apprenticeship model as being significantly impacting the success of the culture, and have indicated this model is only effective in person. There was an amazing article in the New York Magazine last year about a rebellion at Goldman Sachs, and I have to say the model sounded more like hazing and less like apprenticeship to me. And then there were a lot of bankers saying, well, I had to do it and never did me any harm. But a CEO recently has been quoted saying remote work slows down honesty and decision making. So Jay, is this true? Is it not true? What do you think about these comments about the apprenticeship model and how the banking industry might need to evolve to take account of these new pressures that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I'm in science and we have the same model, which is apprenticeship. Like you do your PhD for 5 or 6 years under a mentor, and it's a really close relationship. So the model is the same in the world that I live in. But it's weird because in academia and science, no one's like having that debate because we don't assume that it needs to be fully in person. when Ben was talking, it was like music to my ears because I'm like, if you think this apprenticeship model matters, do an A/B test, and it can be a pilot test. Do it on a small scale for a year, 6 months. Take 100 people and randomly assign them to, which is probably a tiny sliver of the employees at Goldman Sachs, and put them in full time. Maybe and then have people work remotely, and then you could also have a third condition where there's some kind of hybrid. Maybe they come in 2 days a week, and then you get some benefits of in person. You can see if there's maybe there is some in person that's necessary, but maybe once you've done it for a day or 2 a week, you're at threshold and you don't accrue any additional benefit from those extra days. And then you could also look at things like retention. Like there's the mass resignation, everybody's switching. There's all these dimensions. You want to look at their performance, but you should also care about all these other things that we tend to ignore, which is like, do you actually retain them after their apprenticeship is over? And that's where I think some kind of hybrid model is actually really going to dominate, because they're going to feel, and there's some research on this, that they're probably going to feel a greater connection socially to the people that they work with if they actually get some contact with them, and greater organizational identification. And those things are going to buffer against willingness to leave, but they'll probably benefit from the apprenticeship and the personal connection, but they'll also have the flexibility and maybe even more efficiency of working from home several days a week. And so I think that's actually probably what you're going to, that would be my prediction with the data. But again, it's just a prediction. But if you actually care, if you're a financial services company, you care about making money, you care about being efficient, those are often very data-driven organizations, right? So it's really shocking to me that on one hand, they hire all these quant people from all these elite universities and use it to analyze the markets, but then don't use it to analyze their own practices. That's completely insane to me. Instead, it's just based on the intuition of what they did 30 years ago that seemed to work, but they don't have any control condition or baseline or alternative way that they could have done it. And so that's probably the worst possible way to learn and get better, is do what you did 30 years ago and ignore all the advances in technology and preferences and cultural changes. So that's almost a perfect recipe for stagnation and irrelevance, unfortunately. I'm not saying that it's wrong. It actually might be right. But on average, that's the worst possible strategy for getting better.
Yeah, so I think everyone's nodding furiously, because from the perspective of everybody on this panel, it is insane that organizations spend so much time thinking about behavioral science to get people to buy more things, for example, but do not take advantage of these tools and this thinking in how they might shape culture, which I would say, it's not debatable, is now one of the greatest sources of strategic advantage that you could have. Roshni, I want to return to this question of surveillance. You described really perfectly how it's useful, how it's not useful, what some of the risks really are. I wondered if we could double click on it and talk a little bit more about surveillance tools and leadership. We're thinking on this series of webinars, apart from anything else, about questions of conduct and ethics. And one thing I would observe is that it's very, very difficult, especially for people in compliance and ethics roles, once some kind of technology surveillance tool exists, to push back on using it. And even the thinking that if you don't use these tools and then there's a problem, you will get in trouble with the regulators. You've already described how intrusive these things can be, how they can undermine trust, how they can undermine productivity. So what would your advice be for a leader that's trying to think about how you can optimize use of these tools, perhaps to enhance your culture and make it more of a strategic advantage, without tipping into this panopticon kind of futurist world, which is what I fear and see is happening out there, but I'm hoping you might reassure me.
What Jay was just saying just resonated with me so deeply. It is this sense that, when I look at these types of technological tools that have all of these fascinating abilities to track these million behaviors and track what I'm doing every microsecond, my immediate, let me go back 30 years and figure out what it is that I was doing with it. I was actually using it to monitor people. Now, the thing that we are missing is we're using really sophisticated technologies to behave in ways that we behaved 30 years ago when they were not that sophisticated. And the point of those technologies then were to monitor things like how many widgets was somebody making in an hour. That's not the kind of work we're doing right now. The nature of work has changed. People are remote these days, and people are in organizations where the norms are changing, as all of us have been talking about. So the thing to then understand is it's not a question of, do we want to take these technologies and start applying our psychological models from 30 years ago to say, let's implement these technologies in this particular way, because that's what I've been doing all along. The idea is to say, well, how do we start using these technologies and start understanding the psychological impact that these technologies can have on our people. So once you take any kind of technological implementation, if it's not done right, it is going to lead to dramatically terrible outcomes. And today, every company is investing billions of dollars on AI, but what is that AI being used for? Is it being used for just, doing the same things that we were doing, just more sophisticatedly and just in a way that allows us to get micro level data about what everybody is doing every microsecond? Or do we want to use it to empower our people to start using them in ways that would actually lead to a more inclusive environment where everybody feels that they can be driven by their values and their ethics, and they can actually feel like they're being protected by these technologies? There are companies now that are starting to look at how technologies that allow you to track things that happen in the workplace, including things like harassment, including things like, something could have gone wrong, but you don't know where to track it. Could you track it anonymously so that somebody will have a record of it somewhere? And the reason for that is to start empowering our people to start behaving in ways where they can feel like there is a thing that they can look back to, which is this technological record of what actually happened in that particular situation. This is not for management to look down and start having this kind of, I'm going to monitor you versus I'm going to understand and reward you based on the behaviors that's happening. It is actually to start empowering our people. So then the challenge for leaders is to stop relying on what they were doing based on their intuition. And to Jay's point and to Ben's point earlier, how can we start using the scientific method to understand how to implement new technologies? Because there is going to be a slew of brand new technologies that are going to be able to do a lot more things, including tracking, but also other types of things in the workplace. And you'll notice that I'm not saying surveillance, because I don't believe that that is the way we should be looking at these technologies. It is tracking. We'll strip out all of the, connotations around that behavior. The behavior is just tracking. Now, whether that tracking becomes surveillance or whether that tracking becomes informational is really in the hands of the leaders who choose to implement it in one way or the other.
Oh, fascinating. So at the end of the day, it is all about the leader's mindset and ability to experiment, willingness to learn, humility about human nature, etc. Ben, I would like to, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, the only thing I will add to that is we're talking about the formal means of tracking and surveillance, but the things that Jay and Ben touched upon earlier, the informal norms that actually have led to sort of informal tracking. For example, there is now a lot of pressure where, to Jay's point earlier about how, influencers or leaders behave, and to Ben's point about how that's now become increasingly visible. If you have somebody that's a leader in a group that is on Slack continuously all the time and responding to messages every 5 seconds, then that puts an informal pressure on everybody in the group to start thinking about that as, oh, this person's tracking my behavior on this channel, so I need to be on. I have research, and we're calling this paper the Slack effect, because like anything, the technology itself is not bad. We're finding that there are dual effects. One, it actually allows people to feel closer in remote environments when they communicate on these channels because of the informal norms associated with communicating on these types of channels. You could put a smiley face, you could put jokes, you could put a picture of a cat, and people on the team are going to laugh and smile and feel like they're connected to each other. At the same time, when influential people start behaving in ways that set the norms, where it feels like they're tracking who's on the channel, who's responding, it leads to informal pressure. And that's the downside to the tracking. So it's really not about the technology, it's about how leaders implement these technologies.
Yeah, humans are tricky characters, I guess. So it's not that norms disappear in a remote environment. There are different signals, there are different sorts of norms, and in some ways, norms might be even more powerful. So, Ben, maybe you can walk us through then the impact of physical space on behavior. We've all been in meetings where there were particular atmospheres and we felt pressured to speak or not speak. Something I've observed with teaching is in some ways it's easier, it seems, to get introverts to participate. You can use the chat, you can be more inclusive. You can't, as a professor, see who's friends with who, which can be really, really beneficial. So talk to us a little bit about how physical space influences behavior, and how physical space coming on and off and group norms might influence how our cultures would play out.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I like to think about physical space and think about it as a management tool. Like, if we strip off all of the emotion we have about workplaces and just physical space in general, if we just say, okay, it's a management tool, because what you see in general is that, again, this is not shocking. I would argue it's probably one of the most powerful management tools that organizations have, and that's a reason to keep using it. In the sense that if I sit you next to someone, you talk a lot to them, which is not shocking, right? Like, we know this, but you see these effects. It's not just like sitting right next to people, it's in the same row, it's what is the design of the office, all these things. And that has a really significant effect. And that's way easier than, again, if you think about what do you get when you have an office, like, that's what you get. You get that for free, right? And that's much harder to do remotely. Is it possible? Sure, but if I have to put money down and I say, okay, what is likely to happen? It is likely that without considerable effort, organizations will have a lot less granular control over how work happens. Now, again, the question, of course, is who should get to decide that control? And this gets to Rashi's point. What are you optimizing for actually as an organization? It's complicated, right? Because, again, I could say, well, I want to optimize as an organization. If I lead the company, I can say, all right, I want to optimize for the performance of the organization. And, longer discussion about the fact that most organizations, even a lot of the, financial institutions we're talking about, when it comes to like teams or individuals, have really no KPIs, right? It's like, how much does your boss like you? And pretty much the biggest predictor of that is just how much time you spend with your boss, which is probably not what we care about, right? But even if we say we're optimizing for that, then there's this question of, okay, well, what about me as an employee? I probably care somewhat about organizational performance, but I also want to get promoted, or I want to get paid more. How do we do a trade-off where in particular it might be that me getting promoted and the behaviors that a physical space would encourage for me to get promoted might actually negatively impact the performance of the organization? Like, that is plausible and that will happen sometimes. How do we decide that? That is very, very challenging. And I think in the past, when we thought about physical workspace, it was just sort of like implicitly, like, all right, we believe this is important. We believe it improves performance. We don't really know why. We're going to keep doing it. And I think you can't do that anymore, right? I don't think you should have done that in the past anyway. But this idea of thinking about it as a management tool and using it much more granularly and saying, okay, I need team X and team Y to communicate more with each other. Like, they should be physically together, but then it doesn't have to stay that way for 10 years, and it shouldn't. Like, there's no way that work is that static. And so this idea of changing it very frequently, I think, really matters. Now, an interesting thing is, even when people work remotely, physical space still matters. And this is sort of a weird thing that we've seen. So when we look at time zone differences and how likely are people to communicate depending on how many hours away they are from each other in terms of time zones, you see some interesting effects. And to be clear, it's not totally linear, but just roughly to get a sense of it, for every hour people are away in terms of time zones, they're about 9% less likely to communicate, like, in general, right? And so you get interesting effects where, like, people in New York are more likely to communicate with people in, like, Brazil than on the West Coast, which is interesting, right? But again, even this idea of when people talk about remote work is like, oh, distance doesn't matter. No, it even still matters. Even if you say, I'm going to have everyone work remotely, that still matters. And so, but again, I would just, like, to the extent that, again, we can communicate to the workforce, this is why you should be in 3 days a week, and then maybe, and then sit here, and then, 2 days a week sit there. I think, beyond that, I think eventually we can get to this point again where, even if we use our phones to, like, book a desk, or not even just book a desk, but to be able to say, there's an algorithm there that says, okay, today you should come in and sit here. And most people are going to go with the default, right? And I think maybe here is this possibility of, a place where you can try to unify the optimizations of the organization and the individual, and say like, well, what do I want? What does the organization want? Anyway, it's a longer discussion on this. Obviously, it gets quite complex. But this idea of showing the ROI of physical space in terms of, again, just how we collaborate, like that's how I would really emphasize it. It has a tremendous effect. It is very, very hard to replicate that virtually. I have a lot of hope for, I don't know if people have seen platforms like Spatial or GatherTown. Those are interesting. And they sort of try to replicate some aspects of physical space virtually. I just haven't seen enough data showing that it has similar effects. I think it's plausible maybe in the long term it will. But for right now, again, if I want to, in the span of a week, dramatically change how people work, physical space is like the easiest way to do that.
Fascinating, completely fascinating. Jay, I want to come back. You described this school that you had done research in, and these people that were kind of nodes and hubs in the culture. So culture carriers might be one way we would look at this. And I'm assuming your answer is going to be, I don't know. I haven't done as much research yet to the question of how culture carriers might change in a hybrid environment. But if you were going to do some work, set up an experiment, think about how you would hypothesize this would change, what would be your ideas and anything that you're seeing emerging or hearing so far about how these particularly influential people's roles might change and how hybrid might affect that, maybe tying into this question of physical space we've just been exploring.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Allison. And I'll also try to weave this into one of the questions. I think it was Jose about what are the key skills of leadership leaders require in like this hybrid world. And so I would say that you're going to have to rethink a lot of these principles that are well established in the research and think about how is that going to play out in a hybrid world. And so we already talked about things like Roshni talked about like Slack and how that's become a place where it's necessary to connect and stuff. Or email, the point about like emails coming in at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. from your boss. And so I think the key skill set is how are you going to use this type of collective psychology in a hybrid or virtual world. And so if you want to establish norms or use these people as norms, find ways to profile them in terms of like their email use or the way they communicate in like a Zoom meeting or something like this, or the way that they communicate on Slack, or the way that you respond to them on Slack to affirm the norm that they're setting there. And so I think like that is actually going to be one piece of it. The other piece of it I'd say is, since we don't have the opportunity to observe people as much as we used to working at the cubicle or office next to us, I think you actually have to be more explicit than you did in the past because you're not able to just informally observe people and the dynamics. So I think like you're going to have to formalize things. You're probably going to have to communicate a little bit more and effectively. One thing I would say though is you have to be careful because I saw some data on this week is that meetings are way up during virtual period. And I think part of it is like the point that Roshni brought up about like there's kind of a surveillance culture. We want to make sure everybody's doing what we want them to do. The other one is like we feel disconnected because we're not having those informal chats. And so we formalize it. But instead of a 10-minute chat at the water cooler, now we have a team meeting on Zoom or what I've seen is these tons of town hall meetings that I've had at my work. But if you do a town hall meeting for 40 people and it's for an hour, you just wasted, 40 hours of people's work. And if they're getting paid, $50 or $100 an hour, that's how much that's costing you. And also it's really, people get really cynical about meetings because they feel overburdened, burned out. And so actually, I think you have to think of efficient ways to communicate explicitly. Right now, we're leaning on inefficient strategies. Used to be the case that you could just pop to somebody's office. I had this yesterday when I was in at work. 2 people came by for like 5 or 10 minutes, talked about a complex issue, and moved on. You don't need to hold a giant team meeting for an hour to discuss these things. So I think you need to be more efficient. And I think that key leadership skill is going to think of how can you do the things, for example, like the tips I gave about norm transmission earlier, how can you do those in a hybrid environment? And so that's going to take there's the science, But there's going to be the art of what is the structure of communication at your organization? What tools are you using? You might not be using Slack. You might have different norms. People might be in 1 day a week. And so if you're in 1 day a week, maybe always the worst case scenario, I've seen a lot of articles about this, is like everybody has to come in 2 days a week, but they're in completely different days. And so when they come in, they all just go to their office, close the door, and they're Zoom meeting or whatever virtually with their teammates who are on their team who just didn't come in that day. That's pretty much your worst case scenario for the use of technology, because you get none of the benefits of personal connection. But now they're commuting, and now they're really cynical about why they're coming in, because it seems like a complete waste of their time. And so if you want to come in, you're going to need to coordinate it on a small number of days. But then I would have those days be when you have meetings. That's really good opportunity for group discussion, collective decision making, getting feedback. And then I'll just go to one other thing, and this is where you can use the technology well, I think. One question was, how can you use this? One way I've used it as I've taken over this leadership role is it's really easy to like send a quick survey to people and get a pulse of what people on my team are thinking of. And it takes 5 minutes and they fill it out. And then I share the results and the raw data with them, and they feel heard. They feel the process is transparent. And it also lets me know where I can push, where there's a collective will to do something, and where I'm going to face a lot of resistance, and whether or not it might not be worth pushing something if a chunk of people are against it. And so I use the technology really efficiently to do that, because it's hard to go to people's offices. But that actually is even more efficient than going to people's offices, these little like survey pulses on different issues. And then use the meeting time less to get a pulse and more to discuss the subset of issues where you think there might be consensus.
Oh, fascinating. That's such a good example of how to use technology for good and to save time and provide insight and make everybody feel better. Ben, let's talk a little bit about pressure. This is an important thing to watch. I started off with this example that both whistleblowing and retaliation have advanced. We can also think, we've been talking so far as if everybody can work comfortably in a hybrid environment. Some people may not have a good setup. Some people may be juggling a lot of other pressures. So there's a lot of inequity here potentially in some of these setups. So can you talk about how the amount, the source, the type of pressures have changed on staff in a hybrid environment, and what you think the implications of that are? And then we will, just for everybody listening, we'll be turning to Q&A quite soon. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat for the panelists. But Ben, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, again, I think that, you know, especially over the last couple of years, we've had, again, just to be totally clear, this hasn't just been people working remotely, which, as you pointed out, there's a number of inequities there in terms of, do people have reliable internet access? Do they have, again, space for themselves? I mean, I can even say, you know, even my own case, just subjectively, right? My schedule is more flexible than my wife's. And so during the beginning of the pandemic, my youngest was just, well, in the fall, starting kindergarten. And we did it remotely for a significant period of time. That was basically my, I was sort of on duty for that, which meant it was way easier for me, for example, to take calls and like the evening than it was during the middle of the day, right? And so that's, again, and some of these things I think are positive, right? In terms of, you know, like it's totally possible that one of my kids could walk in right now, right? Like that's possible. Don't think so, so we'll see. But, you know, people being exposed to the fact that like actually your coworkers, your employees, like they are people, right? They have lives. I actually think that's a good thing, but it also does illustrate the fact that we have constraints, right? And I think we used to pretend that we didn't have those constraints, or that, you know, it was unprofessional to bring them in, which I think is totally, it's wrong from a whole variety of perspectives, right? And I think that this is an opportunity now for organizations to think much more holistically about how they work, about how their organizations are managed. But again, this does mean taking into account not just your own experience, because again, if you're a leader in a large company, you're probably, just to be honest, probably extremely rich. You probably have a pretty good setup working from home, like you're fine, right? But that's not the question. You shouldn't be solving for yourself. You should be solving for how does the organization as a whole work? How does understanding more, like I actually don't want to talk to people like myself. I want to talk to people who have very different experiences. Again, there's not necessarily in terms of managing the organization, is that better? It's also, you know, better in terms of like you will have, you know, higher performance, because anyway, longer discussion on that, right? But this idea that we now have these pressures of, again, we're working remotely, and then things from your home, influence what's going on. Again, I do think that we've been better able to, I mean, we probably all remember, do you remember on the BBC, this is like in late 2019, there was that guy who was on BBC and his like kids came in, everyone's like, oh, that's hilarious. That's not hilarious anymore. That is just like, everyone knows what that is. You're like, oh, okay. Like that, if that happened on the news today, no one would bat an eye. You'd be like, all right, sure. And I think, so those things are healthy, right? That we've removed that. But again, I do think that the flip side of it is we've seen in the data, for example, like work days have gotten longer. People aren't working more hours in terms of like just actual time working, but the span of the workday is longer, which means your work and your home life are integrated in a more deep level. And there's some arguments where sometimes that's good. Again, in my case, I wouldn't say that's like good. It was necessary, right, for me to work in that way, right? But there is an awful lot of data that also leads to burnout, higher attrition, and like I think Jay was mentioning that earlier. And so this inability for folks to separate, I mean, I don't think you can ever totally separate, but for people to, let's say, turn off more easily and say that they're not available, that is going to be a really big just issue, I think, moving forward. Again, if organizations don't develop, you know, these norms and practices around how you value people's time, around how you value people's home lives, I think, again, that like now is the time and the opportunity to do that. It will only get harder over time.
So you need to deliberately help people create a space of safety and privacy to get their work done for at least some pockets of the day for maximum effectiveness and to help correct for some of these things. We'll turn to the Q&A in a second. I have several coming in. But before we do that, last direct question from me to Roshni. What's coming next when it comes to technology? What developments are you watching, and what are you thinking about as you think about the future of the world at work, and what you think is going to be so most significant?
So the thing that is probably the obvious answer here is AI and how AI is being implemented in the workplace. But I want
Roshni, you have to call it adaptive statistics.
Adaptive statistics. There it is. The thing that I want to, really shine a light on and underline is it is less about the type of technological tool and more about using those technological tools to help people and our organizations really acknowledge the full person. This pandemic has allowed us to have an opportunity to truly shape how the future of the workplace can be. And if we look back and just say we want to go back to a pre-pandemic normal, that is a missed opportunity. That is honestly not the way to implement or leverage any of these technologies for positive good. So the way for us to think about AI, the way for us to think about any of these technologies related to surveillance or tracking, the way we can start thinking about how we start thinking about any of these technologies would really have to be a people-centric approach. So there is research now that tells us that technologies can enable people to feel closer together. Technology that allows people to actually feel like they're interacting with entities like AI that can feel more empathetic towards you and make you feel supported when there is actually less support. I have some work that says, well, when people need social support in the workplace after aversive experiences, they actually feel better, feel less anxious and less stressed when they believe that that support is coming from AI versus when they believe that that support is coming from a coworker. And a lot of this is because of the psychology of how these technologies influence us. When there is technology, we're talking about an entity that doesn't have mind, that doesn't have the ability to judge you. This ability to go and interact with an entity that can strip away judgment from an interaction, strip away judgment from context is actually very freeing. It's very psychologically safe, and it allows people to feel like they can have an honest discussion. So how can leaders in organizations start thinking about the whole person? How can they implement technologies that would allow us to actually help people who may be integrators, people who like that work and life integrating, being able to work at 5 a.m., but then again at 11 p.m., but not in the middle of the day? How can it help people who are these segmenters, who like to have the 9 to 5 and who like to have their work during the work hours and home hours just be strictly for home. So it is really not a one size fits all solution. So when we think about any of these novel technologies, using a people-centric approach, thinking about the full person and being able to understand that this is not a one size fits all, but one that has to be research driven, experimentally understood, and scientifically tested method that works for your particular team. That's really my call for leveraging technologies for positive good.
Excellent. I am so inclined to think about the advance of technology as dystopian, that you've done a really good job in explaining how this could be amazing. It could be really beneficial. It could help us have more satisfying and exciting and productive lives. So a really nice counter to how I tend to think. But again, we're back at this point of needing expertise and experimentation and rigor and not making any assumptions about how this technology might work. Okay, so turning to the Q&A now, there's a really interesting question from Daryl Hendricks, and I'm going to start with Jay because we've heard from Roshni on this a little bit already. Again, about this balance between the ability to monitor for misconduct, the ability to maybe detect problems before they start in a way that we didn't have when we were physically all together, versus this wider breakdown in trust that I've seen and heard about that is associated with pervasive surveillance. So how would you think about that? How would you advise a leader on that question?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really great question. It's actually really challenging. I don't want to give a glib answer. So I'll build maybe, if I can, just a small amount on what Roshni said. The first thing, and I think of things through collective psychology, group identity. I've talked about organizational identification, the role of that in commitment and retention. People have asked about quiet quitting and mass resignation in the questions. It's related to that. So it's not just that you erode trust if people feel like they're spied on, is that you erode identification. They don't feel like they're part of a valued member of a group if you constantly have your eye on them. And so that's going to lead them to be looking for other jobs, disengaging. Quiet quitting has been around for a long time. It's called, it was for a long time disengagement. Before that, it was called presenteeism, which is like you're there, but you're not doing anything. Lots of great. Office Space was like one of my favorite funny movies on that. And that movie's like 25 years old, 30 years old. So these things have been around a long time. And organizational surveillance has been around a long time. It's just become, there's a unfortunate dynamic, I think, that's happening right now where all these things about quiet quitting are going viral on TikTok and getting in the news. Companies are seeing that and thinking, wow, my employees are working remote. They refuse to come in. And now I'm hearing that they're quiet quitting. I have to spy on them more. And then that's like what you call a vicious cycle where then they're even less identified and less engaged and want to leave. And then the companies even have to do it more. And so that's actually if your organization is doing that, you're already on the downward spiral. Organizations that are flourishing are doing the opposite. They have mutual trust and respect. They don't need to spend the money and the oversight to do those types of surveillance. And then the people feel trusted. They're more likely probably on average to stay. They're more engaged, they're more identified with the organization. And then they're even trusted more by the organization and leaders because they're doing well. And so that's called a virtuous cycle. And so that's what you want to get into. I will say, of course, there's the issue which we're here for, which is unethical behavior. And so I think if you're going to do surveillance, it should be explicitly around unethical behavior. And I would say it should only be for you either use it like Roshni said, and you're using it so people can help track their productivity or something like we all do already with all kinds of technology. When I go for a run, I'm tracking how far I went and how much time it took. And so you could use it for informational purposes, or you could use it explicitly when you're doing certain things, like maybe when you're doing some kind of standardized exam or professional exam, but not at other times. And so I think that you want to use it really judiciously and also communicate clearly what the function of it is and show the data so that people can actually use it for their own purposes and understand it. So part of that requires transparency. And so if you're going to get data from them and you're not going to be transparent with it, then you're creating the conditions for distrust and conspiracy theories. And by the way, I study conspiracy theories, and one of the predictors of them is people in low positions of power and low positions of trust assume that people in power are doing nefarious things to them. And so if something bad happens to them, they don't get a promotion, they might think it's because you're using the data. data, even if it has nothing to do with that. And so that's why you want to have complete transparency if you are using these things, so that people don't devolve into that kind of, like I was saying, the vicious cycle.
Fascinating, completely fascinating. There's another question. We were talking about meetings that are inefficient, and I wondered if anyone, maybe I'll ask you, Ben, can you provide examples of how to run more efficient meetings in a hybrid environment, in a remote environment, how to get to the point, how to stop this meeting overload and the gumming up of the works that we've been talking about, because everyone feels that they have to have formal communication to compensate for the lack of meeting around the water cooler?
Yeah, so we do have a lot of data in this, and then also one of my co-founders and our chief scientist, Tammy Kim, like she did her thesis on this. So also she's we could talk, like, again, I'll also refer to some of her research as well. So at a high level, when we look at data on meetings globally, and this pandemic hasn't dramatically changed some of these things. So basically, these aren't going to be shocking to people, right? But as more people get added to a meeting and as meetings get longer, like outcomes get worse, right? And you can measure it in a bunch of different ways. We can also measure things like multitasking, which again, we have this data, right? So it's like, are people sending email? Like, what percentage of people are sending emails during this meeting, right? And it goes up and up and up, and as it gets longer and longer, and as you get more and more people. And so again, actually one of our customers, which is a Fortune 500 technology company, their CEO looked at these metrics, and now all of his direct reports can only book 30-minute meetings with him. And it's got to be one, like, that's just, and again, they've got to be split up, all those things, right? And it's very simple. This isn't rocket science, right? And I think that sort of the point is, what quantitative data can do is make this real for people, right? Is say, okay, this isn't just people's opinion. And again, like Jay was saying, it's not to say that surveys aren't useful, like they are useful, but a lot of times they don't. First of all, again, there are some things that people are not very good at, like actually understanding, things like weak ties dropping. People are terrible at actually understanding that's happening. And so quantitative data is useful from all these systems, but again, at an aggregated level, not at saying person A has 10% less, weak ties. Who cares? It doesn't matter. Like, you don't know. You have no context on what that person does. But at aggregate level, it does matter, right? And so when we think about meetings, being able to say, okay, as a meeting gets, for every 10 minutes you add to a meeting, it makes it 20% more likely that you're wasting this kind of time. Like, and then you can put a dollar value on that, right? Like that holds weight, and people will start to move, right? I think also what again Tammy Kim showed in her thesis is that meeting dynamics look very, very different as you have people remotely, right? That basically, again, part of this is just like literally physics, right? In that, like, me talking to you all right now, it's not as instantaneous. There's a slight delay in changes that you see in terms of changes to my facial expression, voice, posture, all those things. And so a lot of the normal reaction we have, as well as me not being able to directly look at you, right, has an effect. And she actually quantified this, that again, you get not just in terms of more dominance from some people in general, right, that some people can monopolize conversations more, but also she actually did research looking at creativity and decision-making in a number of tasks, and was able to show that, again, just without any feedback and without any interventions, these remote teams were, the dynamics, the actual outcomes were significantly worse. However, when she started to give feedback, and actually it was automated feedback in this case, just on what was the balance of the conversation, was someone dominating the conversation or not, you could actually get the groups to behave almost identically. And so I think that even without having that software in place, this idea of, whether it's, I mean, again, this is well documented for decades, right? Having an agenda is useful. Like, again, these are not shocking, right? Having agenda is useful. Even having someone who's like a moderator and is able to say, like, stop talking, especially to senior folks. This is something particularly in our Asian customers we see a lot, which is, again, it's not shocking. I lived in Japan for a while. Senior person, in all my meetings, I have data on it. They talk more. We know this, and that leads to worse outcomes in a lot of circumstances, right? So, but who's going to be empowered to do that? Again, I think there's all these questions that organizations have to answer, and that, again, I think they're probably good practices in general. Like, remote work is, I think, a catalyst for us starting to address these issues, but they were always issues, right? Like saying, oh yeah, pre-pandemic, like executives never monopolized conversation. Of course they did. Like, of course they did. I think the difference is now, again, we do have more data on it, which makes it more real, rightly or wrongly. That's just how we feel about it.
Excellent. Thank you. That was really, really helpful. I want to turn to this interesting question from Stuart Hoffman, who is asking about regulated financial institutions. I imagine that's a lot of people on the line. And he'd like thoughts. Let's ask Roshni, can you speak to maintaining a culture of compliance remotely? Stuart cites a headline, JP Morgan hit with $200 million in fines for letting employees use WhatsApp to evade regulators' reach. So what are you seeing going on here? And I think, again, this speaks to the balance between control and trust and the importance of getting this right, because we do know that when employees feel that they are being spied on the whole time, then in many, many ways, ethics and good behavior tends to go down. So thoughts on cultures of compliance in this new world?
Yeah, I want to draw on what Jay was mentioning earlier, where there has to be some level of intentionality about how to use these tools judiciously, right? It cannot be that we are saying, oh, if everybody's working remotely, they're going to behave unethically. That's just a generalization that's not true. So then the question is, how do we intentionally start designing systems within organizations where some of these tools around tracking can be used specifically for compliance, or like Jay was mentioning earlier, specifically for, monitoring ethical behaviors, by establishing trust at the beginning to very, explicitly tell the organization, the point of this is to protect the organization. And the point of this is to protect us as a group, and not to pinpoint people, or not to start creating a culture where we're going to distrust everybody. Because we know from organizational research that there is a lot of work about how leader behaviors, especially behaviors that seem like they're abusive behaviors, that seem like behaviors that come from a lack of trust, start leading to behaviors that are retaliatory behaviors. And retaliatory behaviors could take any shape or form, including unethical behaviors, including behaviors like not showing up to work. Again, ties into things like disengaging and quiet quitting, and people just like upping and leaving, basically. So the intentionality around how we want to implement technologies, and to start with a place of trust and a culture of trust, is probably going to be critical as we start thinking about creating a compliance culture. Everybody that works in these industries know the importance of behaving in certain ways that doesn't get themselves and their organizations in trouble. So I don't think that's actually rocket science for people to say, wow, okay, they have now this technology to start, tracking us in this particular way. I think people understand that when they sign up to join these organizations. What they are not okay with is that there are these types of surveillance practices that happen that don't get employee buy-in. So getting employee buy-in and then creating and starting from a place of trust is probably going to help sustain a compliance culture, or sustain a culture where people can work with a sense of trust in the environment, and then start utilizing technologies because everybody has that buy-in and everybody wants to use these technologies for good.
Excellent, thank you. And I am going to, I think, give you this last question as well, because it seems in your wheelhouse, but let me know, Ben or Jeff, if you'd like to say anything about this as well. Virtual reality, you did not mention, Roshni. We are all, maybe it's just me, looking with some dread at the emergence of the metaverse. But what could we do with virtual reality and creating kind of virtual communities that might be helpful here, if anything?
The way I perceive, as you all have heard me talk today, is I perceive any technology as a tool that can be leveraged for positive good if we implement them properly. I have some research on virtual reality that tells us that it's a platform that allows us to engage in communication in ways that allows for psychological safety if they're implemented in ways where, and only in times where, people need that kind of psychological safety. So what virtual reality does is it allows people to engage in a way where they actually feel a little bit psychologically distant from their virtual avatar that's on screen. And because of that, it can lead to both positive and negative effects. So when we think about leveraging virtual reality for connection, it is important to start thinking about how to position virtual reality. What are the types of things that we want to do in the metaverse versus not? It's not that everything can now go from Zoom to metaverse. Let's all wear our headsets. I mean, many of us who've tried it know that those headsets can sometimes lead to migraine. So nobody wants to wear those like all day long, every day. But are there things that we could be doing in the metaverse that we couldn't be doing, say, in face-to-face or Zoom conversations? For example, there's research that shows that if you use virtual reality, you're able to actually allow people to feel like they are a different person. For example, it's being used to talk about inclusion, diversity, and allow people to feel what it is like to be a minority in a particular circumstance. That allows for more inclusion in leadership. That allows for more inclusive cultures being formed, because now you are able to viscerally experience what it is to be in the body of somebody that's a minority. There's other work that says, well, when there are things that could cause psychological discomfort, people actually don't want to feel like they are that avatar. So that psychological distancing allows them to be more honest, allows them to disclose more about themselves, allows them to feel more psychologically safe when they're having threatening interpersonal interactions. So the question is to leverage the science behind virtual reality, as opposed to saying, we have the billions of dollars, let's get all people headsets and force meetings on the metaverse. Instead, understanding the science behind that and saying, what are the ways in which we can start leveraging this technology in ways that would actually help people? So if it is going to be a psychologically threatening interpersonal situation, perhaps you are providing negative feedback to somebody, you as a leader, you're feeling really uncomfortable, your subordinate is going to feel really uncomfortable. Do you want to do this in the metaverse so they can actually more honestly tell you what's going on, and you can actually more honestly respond to that? So thinking more carefully and judiciously about how we want to implement virtual reality is going to be key.
Excellent. It's all opportunity if you pay attention to behavioral science and social psychology. We have to turn back to John, but 30 seconds, Ben and Jay, on key takeaways and things that you would like people to remember from this panel. Let me start with you, Ben.
Yeah, well, really enjoyed the panel, despite hitting a number of my trigger phrases like AI and metaverse, but I got through it, so it's okay. But I think, again, the general, thing that I'd just like to emphasize is that, as a lot of us were saying, there's now so much data about how work happens, and that can tell us an awful lot of things, but around how our management decisions impact how we collaborate, impact performance, impact retention, all these things we care about. You need to do this in the right way, and that means, again, both Roshni and Jay were talking about a lot of these things in terms of what are we optimizing for, what data we're using, what level of granularity do we look at it, and I'd argue the individual level is almost never useful when it comes to quantitative data for a whole variety of reasons. And what we can do is use it to experiment, iterate, and challenge our assumptions. You don't even have to believe research on a particular topic, because even research tells you what's true on average. It doesn't necessarily tell you what is true in your organization. So even if you don't believe us, just test it with data. And that is what I would recommend that folks do when we think about our culture and how we work.
Yes, your culture is not something you score and measure. Your culture is something you can shape and drive. Well,
I'd say both. But okay, yeah.
I get a lot of, how does my culture score compared to this other organization's culture, that drives me a little crazy. But
does it, yeah.
Jay, over to you for a wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, my bottom line is that these are issues of culture, collective psychology, and that if you build that well, people will follow along with things, even if they don't necessarily privately agree with it. That's what norms do. And so over time, they might start to internalize it if they've been there a lot, they identify. But if they just see what other people are doing and that's what it takes to be a good group member, they'll follow it. So I would think a lot about how you can build structures, practices, reward systems that guide people towards the types of behaviors that you want. And you don't need to do this in ways that are really coercive or that require like, you know, the type of spying that's now being done. In fact, I would argue if you've gone to that, it's almost certainly a failure of your culture. And so what you want to do and what happens under like effective leadership models is that people creatively work towards the group's interest once you make those clear and what those values and norms are. So that's what I would suggest. And I would say this, I've consulted in organizations where they've had compliance problems. And a lot of times they think, well, young people now just cheat more, or maybe we have a few bad apples. Once you start getting the data on what happened, almost always, at least when in the experience I've had, it's almost norms. It's like people thought that everybody was doing it, or they thought they were helping out, or they thought they were getting through it quickly so that they could get to their main job, and that's what was valued. And so once you get in there and look at the data, that's what it says. But people have really bad intuitions. A lot of what this keeps coming back to, this builds on Ben's point, is that people have bad intuitions about what works and why, and they're not measuring and finding out often that it's not working or that it's backfiring. And so that is a massive failure of leadership, and it's probably usually because of some cultural problem that you have. And so that's at the level of analysis that I would think of trying to fix these things. It's not individuals. There's always a few bad apples, but that's not the problem once it leaks out to other people.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody. You've made me, over the last hour, feel a lot better and made me feel that there is so much potential here for good and for better working lives and better cultures and happier people. And so thank you. I don't normally think about this as such a positive topic. Over to you, back to John, to close us out. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you, Allison, for moderating this fantastic discussion. Covered so many topics, so many important things. I can't possibly summarize in a minute, but I will say a couple things that I took away was one is these are a lot of long-standing issues, whether too many meetings or unproductive meetings, a lot of the issues around the importance of norms, values, and behaviors and culture carriers. These were known to be really important for organizations' success. And I think that the remote work and the pandemic has just highlighted them and created some new challenges and opportunities that we were discussing. I do think that these themes of experimentation, transparency, humility, not assuming that you know the answers or even know what it is that people are looking for in the organization, I think are really, really important. So also want to thank Roshni, Jay, and Ben for a really active, again, illuminating discussion for leaders, who are thinking about this, about taking the research and the data and putting it into practice. This is just hugely helpful. And I'll just give one last data point for us here at the New York Fed. I mean, we have about 3,000 employees typically, and we've seen 600 hires since the beginning of the pandemic. So 20% of the workforce is new to the organization, who either started during the pandemic or period when we were working fully remote or the time that we've come to this hybrid model. So there's just a large number of people who don't have that long experience and with the norms, values, behaviors, and everything. And for us, this is just a really, really important time to make sure that we take on board all of these lessons from research and from these discussions. So again, everybody, thank you so much. Look forward to our future events. I think this is our 9th webinar, and we'll be planning more for next year. So please stay tuned on that. And also, I'll just remind you on the survey, please, we really need to want to get your feedback. So please fill out the survey when you have time. With that, everybody stay safe.